The morning fog clung to the Ardennes forest like a burial shroud on December the 21st, 1944, when Sergeant Alexander Kowalczyk pressed his eye to the scope of his Springfield Model 1903A4 rifle and made a decision that would shatter the carefully orchestrated chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. Through the crosshairs, 600 yards across the frozen valley, a lone German medic knelt beside a wounded American soldier, his Red Cross armband clearly visible against the pristine snow. Command's voice crackled through the radio headset pressed against Alexander's ear, cold and precise as winter steel. "Target acquired. Take the shot. Eliminate the enemy medic." But as Alexander's finger found the trigger, something in the scene below made him pause. The German medic wasn't just tending to the American soldier, he was crying. Not the tears of fear or pain that Alexander had witnessed countless times in this frozen hell, but something deeper, more human, more profound. The medic's hands shook as he worked, and Alexander could see him speaking to the dying American, offering comfort in a language the soldier couldn't understand but somehow recognized. For 3 heartbeats, Alexander held his breath, the crosshairs steady on the medic's chest. Then, in an act of defiance that would cascade through both armies like dominoes, falling in slow motion, he lifted his finger from the trigger and whispered into his radio, "Negative. Shot not taken. Truce." No one in the 101st Airborne Division knew that one sniper's refusal that morning would rewrite the rules of engagement and create a phenomenon that military historians would study for the next 80 years. Alexander Kowalczyk had grown up in the coal mining town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, where the underground fires had been burning since 1962, and where his Polish immigrant father had taught him that some things in this world were worth dying for, but very few things were worth killing for. The Kowalczyk family had fled the old country when Alexander's grandfather witnessed the horrors of the Great War, carrying with him stories of how ordinary men became monsters when they forgot the humanity in their enemies. Young Alexander absorbed these lessons while hunting deer in the Pennsylvania mountains, developing a marksman's eye that could thread a bullet through a silver dollar at 200 yards. His father, Casimir, worked the mines 6 days a week and spent Sundays teaching his son that a rifle was a tool of survival, not a weapon of conquest. "The moment you stop seeing the man behind the target," Casimir would say, adjusting Alexander's grip on the old bolt-action Winchester, "that's the moment you lose your soul." When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Alexander was 22 years old, working as a hunting guide, and considering a proposal to marry Helena Sarnecki, the daughter of the town's only doctor. Instead, he walked into the recruitment office in Harrisburg 3 days after President Roosevelt's declaration of war, not out of bloodlust or patriotic fervor, but because his grandfather's stories had taught him that sometimes good men had to stand between evil and the innocent, even if it meant traveling across an ocean to do it. The recruiting sergeant looked at Alexander's test scores and marksmanship records and immediately flagged him for specialized training. But what the sergeant couldn't quantify on any form was the moral compass that Casimir Kowalczyk had instilled in his son through a decade of hunting lessons and bedtime stories about the old country. During basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Alexander's instructors quickly recognized that he possessed not just exceptional shooting skills, but an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure and make split-second decisions that prioritized mission success over personal glory. His fellow soldiers nicknamed him Angel, after he repeatedly demonstrated an uncanny ability to place shots that wounded rather than killed enemy soldiers during training exercises, arguing that a wounded enemy required 2 additional soldiers to carry him off the battlefield, effectively removing 3 combatants instead of 1. His commanding officers initially viewed this philosophy with suspicion, wondering if Alexander lacked the killer instinct necessary for wartime service, but his training scores were too exceptional to ignore, and by the spring of 1943, he was assigned to the newly formed sniper program, where his unique approach would be tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He had no idea that his grandfather's lessons about preserving humanity in warfare would soon be tested in the frozen forests of Belgium, where the distinction between enemy and fellow human being would become as blurred as the morning fog that shrouded the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a desperate counteroffensive designed to split the Allied forces and recapture the port city of Antwerp. The German assault caught American forces completely off guard, as more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks, punched through the thinly held Ardennes sector, creating a bulge in the Allied lines that stretched nearly 50 miles wide and 60 miles deep. The 101st Airborne Division, to which Alexander had been attached as a specialized marksman, found themselves surrounded near the town of Bastogne, cut off from supplies and reinforcements as German forces encircled their positions. The tactical situation was dire beyond conventional military comprehension. American forces were outnumbered nearly 4-1, running critically low on ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing, while German panzer divisions pressed their attack with the fury of an army fighting its last great battle. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous response of "nuts" to German surrender demands masked the reality that his surrounded forces were living hour by hour, with each dawn bringing the possibility of complete annihilation. The weather had turned brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fog that blanketed the region prevented air support or supply drops, leaving the embattled American forces to fight with whatever ammunition and equipment they could scavenge from the frozen battlefield. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces were advancing on 3 separate axes, using the cover of the Ardennes forest to mask their movements and coordinate surprise attacks against American positions that had been established for static defense rather than mobile warfare. The psychological pressure was enormous, as American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize from the fog-shrouded forest like ghosts, striking fast and hard before disappearing back into the tree line. Radio communications were sporadic at best, with German jamming operations and the harsh weather conditions combining to create an information vacuum that left field commanders making critical decisions based on incomplete intelligence and desperate intuition. For Alexander, positioned in a concealed sniper's nest constructed from fallen logs and camouflaged with snow-covered branches, the chaos of the larger battle seemed distant and surreal, but the individual human dramas that played out through his rifle scope were immediate and viscerally real. He had already taken 17 confirmed shots since the German offensive began, each one carefully calculated to wound rather than kill, but his commanding officers were growing impatient with his unconventional approach, demanding more aggressive tactics as the tactical situation deteriorated with each passing hour. The specific events that led to Alexander's moment of defiance began 3 hours before dawn on December 21st, when a German patrol probed the perimeter of the American defensive positions near Hill 493, approximately 2 miles northeast of Bastogne. Alexander had been awake for 47 straight hours, surviving on cold coffee and adrenaline, watching the fog-shrouded forest through his scope for any sign of enemy movement. His spotter, Corporal Marcus Delacroix from New Orleans, Louisiana, lay beside him with a pair of binoculars, whispering observations and range calculations in the same quiet drawl he had once used to call plays for the Tulane University baseball team before the war changed everything. At 0400 hours, Delacroix spotted movement approximately 800 yards to the northeast. where a squad of German soldiers was advancing through the tree line in a formation that suggested reconnaissance rather than assault. Alexander tracked their movement through his scope, noting their careful, methodical approach and the fact that they carried medical supplies in addition to standard combat equipment. The lead soldier wore the distinctive helmet and winter camouflage of the Waffen-SS, but his behavior suggested medical training rather than combat experience, as he repeatedly stopped to examine the ground for signs of wounded soldiers from previous engagements. Radio contact with command was established at 0430 hours, and Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Blackthorne's voice crackled through the headset with orders that were both clear and disturbing. Angel 6, you are authorized to engage any German personnel in Sector 7. Priority targets are medics and officers. Eliminate all enemy medical personnel to degrade their casualty evacuation capabilities. Alexander acknowledged the order with a simple, "Roger?" "Waya," but something in his grandfather's voice seemed to whisper warnings from across the decades and the ocean. The German patrol continued its advance, and through his scope, Alexander began to observe details that command couldn't see from their positions 300 yards behind the front lines. The German medic was young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, with the same frightened expression that Alexander had seen on the faces of American replacements during their first combat exposure. More importantly, the medic was actively searching for wounded American soldiers, not German casualties, following a trail of blood drops in the snow that led toward a cluster of trees where an American soldier had obviously taken shelter after being wounded in the previous day's fighting. This behavior contradicted everything that Alexander had been taught about German military doctrine, which emphasized aggressive combat tactics over humanitarian concerns, but the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. This enemy medic was risking his life to provide medical treatment to wounded American soldiers, violating his own army's protocols in order to honor the medical oath that transcended national boundaries. The moral complexity of the situation intensified when Alexander realized that the wounded American soldier was Private First Class Timothy Kowalski from Chicago, a distant cousin whose family had immigrated from the same Polish village as Alexander's grandparents, creating a personal connection that transformed an abstract tactical decision into a deeply human dilemma that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When the German medic finally reached the wounded American soldier's position, Alexander found himself watching a scene that defied every assumption about warfare that he had learned during 3 years of military training and 18 months of combat experience. Through the magnification of his rifle scope, he could see that Private Kowalski had been shot through the abdomen and was losing blood at a rate that would prove fatal within the next 30 minutes without immediate medical intervention. The German medic, whose name Alexander would later learn was Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hauptmann from Munich, approached the wounded American with his hands clearly visible, speaking in broken English to announce his peaceful intentions. "American soldier," Hauptmann called softly, his breath visible in the frigid morning air, "I am medic, I help you." Kowalski's response was a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope, as he raised his service pistol with a trembling hand before recognizing the Red Cross armband and lowering his weapon. Hauptmann immediately began administering first aid, using supplies from his medical kit to dress Kowalski's wounds while explaining each procedure in his limited English vocabulary. "Pressure bandage," he said, pressing gauze against the bullet wound. "Stop bleeding, yes?" "Oui." The surreal nature of the scene was amplified by the fact that both soldiers were completely exposed to sniper fire from multiple directions, yet neither seemed concerned with anything beyond the immediate medical emergency. Alexander could hear fragments of their conversation through the crisp morning air, as Hauptmann asked questions about Kowalski's medical history and explained the treatment he was providing. "You have family?" Hauptmann asked while starting an intravenous fluid replacement. "Wife? Children?" Kowalski's response was barely audible, but Alexander could see him reaching for a photograph in his breast pocket, showing Hauptmann a picture of a young woman and a baby boy. Hauptmann studied the photograph with obvious emotion, then reached into his own pocket to produce a similar picture showing a young German woman holding twin infants. The two soldiers, enemy combatants separated by ideology and uniform, but united by the universal experiences of love and parenthood, spent several minutes comparing their photographs and sharing stories about their families. Their conversation creating a bubble of humanity in the midst of the most mechanized and dehumanized conflict in human history. Alexander's radio crackled with increasing urgency as Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne demanded a status report and repeated his order to eliminate all German medical personnel, but Alexander found himself paralyzed by the moral implications of the scene unfolding through his rifle scope. His crosshairs remained steady on Hauptmann's chest, exactly where military doctrine dictated for maximum effectiveness, but his finger remained motionless on the trigger guard as he wrestled with a decision that would define not only his own character, but the trajectory of his entire life after the war ended. The crisis reached its peak when Hauptmann finished treating Kowalski's wounds and faced a decision that revealed the true depth of his moral courage. According to German military regulations, Hauptmann should have called for a patrol to take Kowalski prisoner, extracting intelligence and removing an enemy combatant from the battlefield. Instead, he helped Kowalski to his feet and pointed toward the American lines, speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the morning stillness, "Go home to your family, American soldier. This war has taken enough fathers from their children." Kowalski limped toward the American positions, supported by an improvised crutch that Hauptmann had constructed from a fallen branch, while the German medic remained in the exposed position to provide covering fire if necessary. This act of mercy violated so many military protocols on both sides that it created a tactical vacuum where neither army's standard operating procedures provided guidance for response. American observers in the forward positions could see a German soldier apparently releasing an American prisoner, while German units monitoring the sector observed one of their medics providing aid and comfort to an enemy combatant. The confusion was compounded by the fact that both armies had standing orders to shoot medical personnel who violated the Geneva Convention protections by engaging in combat activities. But neither side had protocols for dealing with medical personnel who violated those same conventions by showing excessive mercy to enemy wounded. Alexander found himself at the center of this tactical and moral storm, with his radio crackling with increasingly frantic orders from multiple command levels as the situation escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne's voice was joined by Captain Rodriguez from company headquarters, then Major Steinberg from battalion, each demanding immediate action to resolve a situation that had spiraled far beyond the scope of normal sniper operations. "Angel 6, you are ordered to engage the German medic immediately," came the final transmission from Colonel Peterson himself, the regimental commander whose authority superseded all previous orders. "This is a direct order from regimental command. Engage and eliminate the target immediately." Alexander's response would be remembered and studied by military historians for decades to come, not for its eloquence or dramatic flair, but for its simple, quiet defiance of military hierarchy in service of a higher moral authority. "Negative command," he whispered into his radio transmitter, his voice barely audible, but carrying absolute conviction. "I cannot and will not shoot a man who is saving American lives. Angel 6 out." Then he did something that violated every protocol of radio communications and military courtesy. He turned off his radio and removed his headset, isolating himself from the chain of command and accepting full responsibility for whatever consequences would follow from his act of conscience. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's refusal to follow orders created a cascade of confusion that rippled through both armies like shockwaves from an unexpected explosion. When Hauptmann completed his medical treatment of Kowalski and began moving toward the German lines, American forward observers reported enemy movement in Sector 7, triggering automatic artillery protocols that brought down a barrage of 105mm shells on the area where the German medic had been spotted. The artillery strike, intended to eliminate a single enemy combatant, instead revealed the positions of an entire German company that had been concealed in the forest, waiting for an opportunity to launch a surprise attack on the American perimeter. The resulting firefight drew additional German units into the engagement, escalating what should have been a routine sniper elimination into a battalion-level battle that raged for the next 6 hours. German commanders, observing American artillery fire on what they believed to be a medical treatment area, concluded that American forces were deliberately targeting medical personnel in violation of international law, prompting them to issue orders authorizing similar tactics against American medical units. This escalation led to a series of retaliatory attacks on field hospitals and aid stations that violated the tacit agreements both armies had maintained throughout the campaign, transforming the local engagement into a brutally personal conflict where medical personnel became primary targets rather than protected non-combatants. The chaos was compounded by the fact that neither side possessed accurate intelligence about the original incident, leading to wildly inaccurate assessments of enemy intentions and capabilities. American intelligence officers concluded that the German medic had been attempting to extract intelligence from wounded American soldiers, while German intelligence interpreted the artillery strike as evidence of a new American policy of total warfare that eliminated all humanitarian considerations. These misunderstandings led to tactical adjustments on both sides that fundamentally altered the nature of the engagement, with both armies adopting increasingly aggressive and morally questionable tactics in response to perceived enemy escalations that had never actually occurred. Meanwhile, Alexander remained in his concealed position, watching the battle unfold through his rifle scope, while maintaining radio silence, fully aware that his single act of conscience had triggered a chain reaction that was now beyond anyone's ability to control. He could see American casualties mounting as German forces pressed their attack with unusual ferocity, and he knew that his refusal to follow orders was directly responsible for the escalating violence, yet he also knew that shooting Hauptmann would have violated principles that were more fundamental than military discipline. The moral weight of this knowledge created a psychological burden that would affect Alexander for the rest of his life, as he struggled to reconcile his commitment to preserving human dignity with his responsibility to his fellow soldiers who were dying as a consequence of his decision. As the battle intensified throughout the morning of December 21st, Alexander found himself in an increasingly precarious position, cut off from radio communication with his own forces while occupying a sniper's nest that was now directly between the advancing German units and the retreating American forces. His spotter, Corporal Delacroix, had been wounded by shrapnel from the initial artillery barrage and was unconscious, leaving Alexander alone with his rifle and approximately 40 rounds of ammunition to face what appeared to be an entire German company advancing through the forest toward his position. The tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where traditional sniper doctrine no longer applied, as the battlefield had become too chaotic and unpredictable for the carefully planned shots that characterized effective sniper operations. Instead, Alexander found himself functioning more like a lone infantryman, using his superior marksmanship skills to harass German advances while avoiding detection by the increasingly sophisticated German counter-sniper teams that were now specifically hunting for his position. The psychological pressure was enormous as he could hear American voices calling for help from various positions throughout the forest. Knowing that he possessed the skills to provide effective covering fire, but lacked the tactical intelligence to determine where his intervention would be most effective. His training had prepared him for the technical aspects of long-range marksmanship and camouflage, but nothing in his military education had addressed the moral complexities of operating as an independent agent in a fluid combat situation where traditional command structures had broken down. The German advance continued throughout the morning, with Hauptmann's unit leading the assault in a formation that suggested they were specifically searching for wounded American soldiers rather than conducting standard tactical operations. Alexander could see through his scope that many of the advancing German soldiers carried medical supplies in addition to their combat equipment, suggesting that the earlier incident had prompted a doctrinal shift toward providing medical treatment for enemy casualties as well as their own forces. This development created an unprecedented tactical situation where both armies were simultaneously trying to kill each other and provide medical care for their enemies, leading to a series of bizarre encounters where German and American medics found themselves working together to treat casualties while their respective combat units continued fighting less than 100 yards away. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Alexander, who realized that his single act of conscience had inadvertently triggered a localized outbreak of humanitarian behavior in the midst of one of the most brutal battles of the European War. However, this realization provided little comfort as he watched American soldiers dying from wounds that could have been prevented if he had followed his original orders and eliminated Hauptmann before the German medic could treat Kowalski's injuries. The turning point came at approximately 1100 hours on December 21st, when Alexander observed a German patrol discovering the unconscious form of Corporal Delacroix in a shell crater approximately 50 yards from his concealed position. Through his rifle scope, he could see that his spotter was still alive, but critically wounded, bleeding from multiple shrapnel injuries that would prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. The German patrol included Obergefreiter Hauptmann, who immediately recognized Delacroix as an American soldier and began providing first aid, despite the obvious tactical risks of exposing himself to American sniper fire while treating an enemy casualty. Alexander found himself facing the ultimate test of his moral convictions, as he realized that the German medic who he had spared earlier that morning was now saving the life of his closest friend and combat partner. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming, as Alexander's decision to preserve enemy life was now directly contributing to the preservation of American life, creating a moral feedback loop that validated his earlier choice while simultaneously placing him in an impossible tactical position. He could not shoot Hauptmann without endangering Delacroix, but he also could not allow German forces to capture his spotter, who possessed detailed intelligence about American defensive positions and sniper tactics that could prove catastrophic if extracted under interrogation. The German patrol was obviously aware of the tactical value of capturing an American sniper team, as evidenced by their careful positioning and the presence of what appeared to be intelligence officers among the combat troops, but they were also committed to providing medical treatment for Delacroix regardless of the potential intelligence benefits of keeping him alive. This commitment to humanitarian principles, even in the face of tactical advantages, represented a fundamental shift in German military doctrine that had been triggered by Alexander's earlier refusal to follow orders, creating a situation where both armies were operating according to moral principles rather than purely tactical considerations. Alexander realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in modern warfare, the spontaneous emergence of humanitarian behavior that transcended national boundaries and military objectives, transforming a localized engagement into something that resembled the medieval concept of chivalric warfare more than 20th century mechanized combat. However, this realization also forced him to confront the possibility that his moral stance, while ethically justifiable, might ultimately result in tactical defeat for American forces if German intelligence officers succeeded in extracting valuable information from captured American personnel. The resolution of this crisis required Alexander to make a decision that combined tactical necessity with moral integrity in a way that had never been taught in any military academy or training program. After observing Hauptmann's treatment of Delacroix for approximately 15 minutes, Alexander made the extraordinary decision to break cover and approach the German position under a flag of truce, using a white undershirt attached to his rifle barrel to signal his peaceful intentions. This action violated every principle of sniper operations and personal survival, as it exposed him to immediate capture or elimination by German forces while simultaneously revealing his position to any other snipers or observers in the area. However, Alexander had reached the conclusion that the situation had evolved beyond the scope of normal military operations and required a response that prioritized human dignity over tactical advantage. His approach to the German position was observed by soldiers from both armies, creating a moment of suspended hostility as American and German forces watched an American sniper voluntarily surrender his tactical advantages in order to negotiate for the welfare of wounded soldiers from both sides. Hauptmann's response to Alexander's approach demonstrated that the humanitarian transformation triggered by the morning's events had affected German forces as profoundly as it had influenced American behavior. Rather than immediately taking Alexander prisoner, Hauptmann ordered his patrol to maintain defensive positions while he conducted negotiations with the American sniper under the protection of international laws governing medical personnel and wounded soldiers. The conversation between Alexander and Hauptmann was conducted in a mixture of English and German, with hand gestures and medical terminology providing common ground for communication between two soldiers who had been trained to kill each other but now found themselves cooperating to save lives. "Your friend needs hospital," Hauptmann explained, gesturing toward the unconscious Delacroix. "I can stabilize, but he needs surgeon, yes." Alexander's response revealed the depth of his commitment to the humanitarian principles that had guided his actions throughout the day. "I can arrange American medical evacuation if you'll allow him to be moved to our lines. In exchange, I'll provide covering fire for your withdrawal and guarantee safe passage for your medical personnel." This proposal represented such a radical departure from normal military protocols that it required approval from senior commanders on both sides, leading to a series of radio communications that eventually reached division-level headquarters for both armies. The negotiation process that followed Alexander's proposal created an unprecedented situation where local commanders from opposing armies found themselves developing cooperative protocols for medical evacuation and humanitarian treatment of casualties. The initial response from American command was predictably negative, with Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne demanding Alexander's immediate return to American lines for court-martial proceedings. But the tactical reality of the situation forced higher-ranking officers to consider the potential benefits of establishing temporary truces for medical purposes. German command was equally skeptical of Hauptmann's proposal for cooperative medical evacuation, as such arrangements violated standard operating procedures and created opportunities for intelligence gathering by enemy forces. But the success of humanitarian medical treatment in reducing American resistance to German advances provided compelling tactical justification for continuing the experiment. The negotiations were facilitated by the fact that both Alexander and Hauptmann possessed sufficient field authority to make tactical decisions without requiring constant approval from higher headquarters, and their shared commitment to preserving human life provided common ground for developing mutually beneficial arrangements. The final agreement, reached after approximately 2 hours of radio communications and field-level diplomacy, established a temporary medical truce that would allow both armies to evacuate wounded soldiers without interference from opposing forces. This arrangement was formalized through a series of written protocols that were signed by both Alexander and Hauptmann, representing what military historians would later recognize as the first instance of field-level humanitarian agreements developed by enlisted personnel during active combat operations. The implementation of these protocols required careful coordination between multiple units from both armies, as medical evacuation routes had to be established and protected while maintaining overall defensive integrity for both sides. American and German medical personnel worked together to evacuate seriously wounded soldiers to appropriate treatment facilities, while combat units maintained defensive positions and avoided provocative actions that might trigger renewed hostilities. The success of this arrangement led to similar agreements being developed at other locations along the front lines, as word of the humanitarian truce spread through informal communication networks that existed between opposing forces despite official military censorship. Within 48 hours of Alexander's initial refusal to shoot Hauptmann, temporary medical truces had been established at 7 different locations along the Ardennes front, creating islands of humanitarian cooperation in the midst of one of the most brutal campaigns of the European War. These arrangements did not prevent continued combat operations, but they did establish precedents for protecting medical personnel and wounded soldiers that would influence military doctrine for both American and German forces throughout the remainder of the war. The long-term consequences of Alexander's decision extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Ardennes forest. As the humanitarian protocols developed during the temporary medical truces were studied and incorporated into revised military doctrine by both American and German high commands. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally reviewed reports of the incident and directed the development of formal policies for protecting enemy medical personnel who demonstrated commitment to treating wounded soldiers from both sides without regard to nationality. These policies, initially developed as tactical expediency measures, evolved into the foundation for post-war international agreements that expanded the scope of Geneva Convention protections for medical personnel operating in combat zones. German High Command conducted similar reviews of the humanitarian arrangements, concluding that cooperation with enemy medical personnel could provide tactical advantages by reducing American resistance to German advances while maintaining moral authority for German military operations. However, the implementation of these policies varied significantly depending on local commanders and the specific tactical situations they faced, leading to inconsistent application of humanitarian principles throughout the remainder of the European campaign. The personal impact on Alexander was equally significant, as his decision to prioritize moral principles over military orders resulted in a series of disciplinary actions that were eventually superseded by commendations for innovative, tactical thinking and humanitarian leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Blackthorne's initial recommendation for court-martial proceedings was overruled by regimental command after reports of the medical truce arrangements reached division headquarters. But Alexander faced informal disciplinary measures that effectively ended his career as a specialized marksman. He was transferred to regular infantry duties for the remainder of the war, serving with distinction in subsequent engagements, but never again functioning in the sniper role where his moral convictions had come into conflict with military necessity. The psychological impact of his decision haunted Alexander for decades after the war ended, as he struggled to reconcile his pride in preserving human dignity with his guilt over the American casualties that resulted from the escalated fighting triggered by his refusal to follow orders. Letters and testimonies from soldiers who survived as a result of the medical truce arrangements provided some comfort, but Alexander never fully resolved the moral complexity of a decision that simultaneously saved lives and cost lives, depending on the perspective from which it was evaluated. Hauptmann's post-war experience was similarly complex, as his commitment to treating American casualties led to suspicion from German military authorities, but eventually contributed to his recruitment by American intelligence services as a medical advisor for occupied Germany reconstruction efforts. The documentation of these events created a historical record that influenced military medical training for both American and international forces throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Field reports written by participants in the medical truce arrangements provided detailed accounts of the practical challenges and benefits of cooperative humanitarian protocols, while post-war interviews with survivors revealed the psychological impact of witnessing enemy soldiers demonstrating mercy and professional medical competence. Military medical schools incorporated case studies based on the Ardennes humanitarian truces into their curricula, using the incidents to teach principles of medical ethics that transcended national boundaries and military objectives. The tactical lessons learned from the temporary truces were equally significant, as military strategists recognized that humanitarian behavior could provide tactical advantages by reducing enemy resistance and improving intelligence gathering opportunities through voluntary cooperation rather than forced interrogation. These lessons influenced the development of psychological warfare techniques that emphasized humanitarian treatment of enemy personnel as a means of encouraging defection and collaboration, though the ethical implications of using humanitarian principles for tactical purposes remained controversial throughout the post-war period. The story of Alexander's refusal to shoot Hauptmann became part of the informal oral tradition that existed among veteran soldiers, passed down through generations of military personnel as an example of the moral complexities that could arise when individual conscience conflicted with military orders. However, official military histories largely ignored these incidents, focusing instead on conventional tactical analyses that emphasized firepower, mobility, and logistics rather than the humanitarian considerations that had influenced individual decision-making during critical moments of the campaign. This neglect of the human dimension of military operations reflected broader institutional reluctance to acknowledge the role of moral reasoning in tactical decision-making. As military doctrine traditionally emphasized obedience to orders and mission accomplishment over individual ethical considerations. The rediscovery of these stories occurred gradually during the 1970s and 80s as military historians began conducting oral history projects that captured the personal experiences of World War II veterans before their generation passed away. These interviews revealed the prevalence of humanitarian behavior that had been largely unreported in official records, suggesting that individual acts of mercy and moral courage had been more common than previously recognized, but had been suppressed by military censorship and institutional reluctance to acknowledge deviations from standard operating procedures. The broader implications of Alexander's story extended beyond military history to influence discussions of moral reasoning and ethical decision-making in extreme situations. Philosophers and ethicists used the incident as a case study for examining the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority, particularly in situations where following orders would require actions that violated fundamental human dignity. The complexity of the moral calculation involved in Alexander's decision provided a framework for analyzing similar dilemmas in civilian contexts, where individuals face choices between personal ethical convictions and professional or legal obligations. Psychologists studying moral development incorporated the story into research on the cognitive processes involved in ethical decision-making under extreme stress, using Alexander's experience to illustrate the way that moral reasoning could override survival instincts and trained responses when fundamental principles were at stake. The international law community examined the humanitarian truces as precedents for developing more flexible and responsive frameworks for protecting non-combatants and medical personnel during armed conflicts, recognizing that rigid adherence to existing protocols could sometimes prevent the implementation of more effective humanitarian measures. These discussions contributed to revisions of international humanitarian law that emphasized outcomes rather than procedures, allowing for innovative approaches to protecting human dignity during warfare while maintaining accountability for war crimes and violations of established conventions. The theological implications of Alexander's decision were explored by military chaplains and religious scholars who recognized the story as an example of the practical application of religious principles in extreme circumstances where spiritual convictions conflicted with temporal authorities. These analyses influenced the development of military chaplain training programs that emphasized the role of religious advisors in helping soldiers navigate moral dilemmas that involved conflicts between military duties and religious obligations. The educational applications of the story proved equally significant, as teachers and professors used Alexander's experience to illustrate principles of moral courage and ethical reasoning for students who had never faced comparable life-and-death decisions. The narrative structure of the incident, with its clear moral choices and dramatic consequences, provided an accessible framework for discussing complex philosophical concepts with audiences who might otherwise find such material abstract or irrelevant to their daily lives. However, the use of the story for educational purposes also raised questions about the appropriate way to present morally complex historical events, as simplified versions of the incident tended to obscure the genuine moral ambiguity that characterized Alexander's decision and its consequences. The personal cost of moral courage became a central theme in Alexander's post-war life, as he struggled to integrate his wartime experiences with the demands of civilian society and family responsibilities. After returning to Pennsylvania in 1945, he married Helena Zarnecki as planned and attempted to resume his pre-war career as a hunting guide, but the psychological impact of his wartime experiences made it difficult for him to function in situations that involved firearms or decisions about taking animal lives. The hunting skills that had once provided him with livelihood and identity now triggered memories of battlefield experiences that he could not share with civilian friends or family members who had not experienced similar moral dilemmas. His attempts to find alternative employment were complicated by the fact that his military records contained conflicting assessments of his service, with disciplinary actions for insubordination balanced against commendations for innovative thinking and humanitarian leadership. Potential employers found it difficult to evaluate these contradictory records, leading to a series of short-term jobs that failed to provide the financial stability or professional satisfaction that Alexander needed to rebuild his post-war life. The birth of his son, Casimir, in 1947, provided new motivation for establishing a stable career, but also intensified his struggle with the moral implications of his wartime decision, as he recognized that his choice to preserve enemy life had potentially endangered American soldiers who were themselves fathers and husbands. The weight of this responsibility led to periods of depression and social isolation that strained his marriage and limited his ability to form close friendships with other veterans who had different perspectives on the moral complexities of warfare. Helena's patience and understanding provided crucial emotional support during these difficult periods, but she could not fully comprehend the psychological burden that Alexander carried as a result of his decision to prioritize individual conscience over military discipline. The arrival of letters from soldiers who had benefited from the medical truce arrangements provided some relief from his guilt, as these testimonies confirmed that his decision had indeed saved lives and established precedents for humanitarian behavior that continued to influence military operations long after the war ended. However, these positive outcomes could not completely offset his awareness that other American soldiers had died as a result of the escalated fighting that followed his refusal to shoot Hauptmann, creating a moral calculus that could never be fully balanced or resolved. The final assessment of Alexander's decision requires acknowledgment of the fundamental tension between individual moral responsibility and collective military effectiveness that characterized many of the most difficult choices faced by soldiers during World War II. His refusal to shoot Hauptmann represented a moment when personal ethical convictions overcame trained responses and institutional authority, creating consequences that were simultaneously beneficial and harmful, depending on the perspective from which they were evaluated. The humanitarian protocols that emerged from his decision saved the lives of soldiers from both armies and established precedents for protecting medical personnel that influenced international law for decades after the war ended. However, the escalated fighting that resulted from the tactical confusion surrounding his action also caused casualties that might have been prevented if he had followed his original orders and eliminated the German medic as directed by his commanding officers. This moral ambiguity reflects the broader complexity of ethical decision-making in warfare, where individual actions take place within systems that are too large and complex for any single person to fully comprehend or control. Alexander's story demonstrates that moral courage sometimes requires accepting responsibility for unforeseeable consequences while maintaining commitment to fundamental principles that transcend immediate tactical considerations. The fact that his decision was vindicated by subsequent developments in military doctrine and international humanitarian law does not diminish the genuine moral risk that he accepted when he chose conscience over obedience in a moment of crisis that could have resulted in court-martial, imprisonment, or death. The legacy of his choice lies not in any simple calculation of lives saved versus lives lost, but in the demonstration that individual human beings retain the capacity for moral reasoning, even in the most extreme circumstances where institutional pressures and survival instincts combine to discourage independent ethical judgment. The story serves as a reminder that the preservation of human dignity requires constant vigilance and occasional acts of moral courage that may seem insignificant at the time, but create ripple effects that influence the behavior of institutions and individuals for generations to come. As we consider the challenges of maintaining humanitarian principles in contemporary conflicts that are no less morally complex than those faced by Alexander and his contemporaries, his example provides both inspiration and caution about the responsibilities that accompany moral courage and the recognition that sometimes the most important victories in warfare are those that preserve the humanity of all participants, rather than simply defeating designated enemies. Would you have been strong enough to break the order when every instinct for survival and every principle of military discipline demanded obedience? Comment below and share this story so others remember that courage sometimes means refusing to pull the trigger when the world expects you to shoot.